Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome. Today, we're heading back to ancient India.
Sounds good.
Yeah. We're going to be looking at the Mahajanapada period, roughly, from 600 to 300 BCE.
Fascinating period.
It is. Now, I know when you hear ancient history, you might think, okay, how does that relate to me? But trust me on this one.
Oh, absolutely.
This era, it witnessed some really, really big economic and social changes. And you know what? They still have an impact today. We're talking about things like land ownership, trade, even labor organization. Like, these are the building blocks of any society, right?
Yeah, the foundations.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that these changes, they weren't happening like in isolation.
Right.
During this Mahajanapada period, you also see the rise of early states in India.
Exactly. So you have this fascinating mix, this interplay of economic, social structures, and power dynamics, all kind of swirling around together.
That's what I love about history. Right? It's never just one thing. It's always like all these forces colliding and impacting each other. And, you remember when we did that deep dive on the Vedic period?
Yeah.
We were talking about that huge shift from a nomadic lifestyle to settled agriculture.
Right, that was a big one.
It was a big one. Well, get ready, because that's kind of like the launching pad for so much of what happened during the Mahajanapada era.
It really set the stage, didn't it? That shift to settled agriculture, it transformed people's relationship with the land itself. And that sparked all sorts of new ideas about ownership and control. Before that, there's evidence suggesting that land was often managed communally.
Oh, interesting.
But as agriculture became like the central focus and these early states started to emerge, we see this rise of private ownership.
So imagine this for a second. You're a farmer during this time. For generations, your family, they worked the land together with their neighbors,
Right.
sharing everything, responsibilities, resources.
Right.
Then suddenly, a powerful lord comes along, claims ownership,
Yeah.
demands taxes, demands labor.
Wow.
That is a huge shift.
Absolutely.
And I bet it caused a ton of anxiety, maybe even sparked some aspirations. Right?
Oh, for sure. And, we see echoes of those anxieties all throughout Indian history, even today. Control over land, it meant wealth, influence, often political power.
It makes sense.
It's not surprising that the people who could gather up all those land holdings, they gained a big advantage.
Right, of course.
But on the other side, those who depended on that communal access, they probably started feeling more and more insecure, vulnerable.
Makes sense. It's so interesting, though, how those ancient anxieties about land, they still resonate with us today, all over the world. It really just underscores that fundamental connection we have as humans to the land that we rely on, right?
The basic human need.
Totally. But the Mahajanapada period, it wasn't just about land. Trade was booming, too, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. Trade was exploding during this period.
What were, like, the big items, the hot commodities?
Yeah. Well, the essentials, obviously. Textiles, iron, salt. But also luxury goods, precious stones, things like that. And it wasn't just local stuff. These trade routes, they crisscrossed India, connecting to these vast networks that extended, like, all the way to Central Asia, even the Mediterranean.
Wow, talk about ancient globalization.
Right.
I mean, that kind of long-distance trade, it must have had a massive ripple effect on everything.
Oh, absolutely.
Did it, create a whole new class of merchants?
You bet. Increased trade definitely fueled the rise of a whole merchant class.
And how did they fit into the existing social hierarchy? Was there, a place for them?
Well, that added another layer of complexity to the social structure, It wasn't simple. And speaking of complexity, with all this increased trade, obviously, you need more labor. Right?
Okay,
Yeah.
Let's talk about labor. Who was doing all this work, and what were the conditions like? Was it all about paid wages back then, or were there still those, traditional obligations in play?
That's a good question, and it's actually a bit of a puzzle. You see evidence for both. Paid labor was definitely a thing, but those traditional obligations were still around too.
Oh, interesting.
It probably varied, depending on where you were, the kind of work, and of course, who had the power.
So not like a one-size-fits-all system. Some workers might be getting a wage, while others were still, fulfilling duties based on their social standing or family ties.
Exactly. It was complicated.
It sounds like it. And where did the Mahajanapadas themselves fit into all of this? Did they have any say in how labor was organized? Were they, setting rules, or were they more hands-off?
That's a key question. It really gets at the role these early states played in shaping the economy. Some scholars believe that certain Mahajanapadas actually specialized in specific economic activities.
Oh, like ancient centers of industry almost.
Yeah, kind of. Imagine one Mahajanapada being famous for its amazing textiles, while another one focuses on, say, metalworking.
That's fascinating. So did that kind of specialization, did that lead to more cooperation between the states? Like maybe a really, really early version of a global supply chain?
Exactly. It probably boosted trade and created some interdependence, but it also shows you how strategically these early states were thinking. Were they actively shaping their economies, or were they just responding to, what was already happening with production and trade? It's a question historians are still debating.
It really is fascinating. It's like we're getting a glimpse behind the scenes, seeing these ancient leaders making decisions that would shape the lives of so many people.
Mm.
But all of this economic activity, it must have had some social consequences too, right?
Yeah.
And we can't forget about those urban centers that were popping up everywhere.
Oh, yeah. Those urban centers were game changers. They weren't just administrative hubs. They were like magnets for trade, crafts, cultural exchange. Imagine these bustling marketplaces filled with goods from, across the known world, skilled artisans crafting exquisite jewelry, metalwork, and people from every walk of life all mingling together, sharing ideas.
Wow. Sounds like a real melting pot. All that activity, all those new ideas, though, I imagine there must have been some tension too, right? Especially as those old ways of life were being challenged.
Absolutely. It was a time of huge upheaval. And anytime you have that much change, you're going to have some friction. And, we can't forget about the caste system. It was starting to take root during this time.
Right, right.
But it's important to remember that social structures were still relatively fluid compared to later periods. So your birth definitely mattered. But your occupation, your wealth, even where you lived, all those things could impact your standing in society.
So it wasn't like everyone was just locked into this rigid hierarchy. There was still some room to move up or down, depending on your circumstances. I wonder what it must have been like to live in that world. All the opportunities, all the risks, constantly having to figure out your place.
It's a fascinating world to imagine, isn't it? And there's still so much we're learning about the lives of the everyday people who lived through these incredible transformations. Yeah, it's a time we're still trying to piece together. And all those transformations, they make you wonder about how these new states, these Mahajanapadas, how did they actually function? Did they all kind of follow like a similar style of government? Or was there, like a variety of political systems?
Ooh, that's a good question. You'd think there would be some differences, right?
Yeah.
I mean, considering how vast ancient India was and all those different cultural influences, were there any, standout systems that emerged?
You're right to think about the diversity. During the Mahajanapada period, there were two main types of states, monarchies and republics.
Okay, so, on one hand, you've got your kingdoms, right? With a central ruler, a king or a queen. And on the other, you've got states where, decisions are made by an assembly or a council. Were those systems, were they totally separate, or did they ever, interact, influence each other?
They weren't totally isolated, no. There's definitely evidence that they interacted. Even sometimes, there was tension between them. Some monarchies, for example, they actually included advisory councils.
Oh.
So that might have limited the king's power a bit.
Interesting.
And then on the flip side, you had republics that had elected leaders, but those leaders often had quite a lot of authority.
So it wasn't just a simple monarchy versus republic kind of thing.
Nope, not at all. It was much more nuanced.
There are shades of gray, variations. It makes you wonder, did they, learn from each other? Borrow ideas?
It's possible they were definitely evolving.
Were there any specific Mahajanapadas that really illustrate these different systems?
Oh, for sure. Magadha, for instance, they're a classic example of a powerful monarchy. They were known for having really ambitious rulers, and they were always trying to expand their territory.
Right.
Then you have the Vajraja Confederacy. They were a republic where decisions were made collectively through these big assemblies.
It's so interesting to see these contrasting approaches. On one hand, you've got Magadha, centralized, focused on expansion. On the other hand, the Vaji, prioritizing collective decision-making. Was there, an inherent advantage to one system over the other?
It's tough to say definitively. Each system had its own strengths and weaknesses.
I see.
Monarchies, with all that centralized power, they could be really effective in, say, a crisis or during a war.
Right.
But they were also super vulnerable to the personality of the ruler, If you've got a bad king, well, that can be a big problem. Republics, though, they encouraged participation. They probably had more checks and balances on power.
Makes sense.
But they could be slow to make decisions. And sometimes they were plagued by internal divisions.
It's like that age-old tension between efficiency and representation.
Yeah.
But these weren't just theoretical systems, were they?
Right.
These systems actually had real-world impacts on people's lives.
Oh, absolutely. They had an impact on everything. Land ownership, taxation, trade regulations, even social mobility.
I see.
Like a powerful monarch, he might decide to reward his supporters by giving them big chunks of land.
Of course.
That would concentrate wealth and power even more.
Makes sense.
But a republic, they might be more focused on, a fair distribution of land.
To try to prevent any one group from getting too powerful.
Exactly. It really depended on the priorities of the leadership.
It makes you think about the pressures those ancient rulers faced. A king might be thinking, okay, how do I hold on to power? How do I expand my territory? But a council, they might be more concerned with keeping things stable, making sure different groups are happy. Are there any clues about which system was, more popular or more successful?
It's hard to say for sure. Both monarchies and republics existed side by side, and some states even, switched back and forth. The historical record, it's complicated. It seems like success depended on a bunch of different factors: leadership, economic conditions, even external threats.
So no easy answers. No clear winner in the political system game.
Nope. It's all a bit messy.
Makes sense. I guess history usually is, right? But, I'm curious about what life was actually like for the everyday people in these Mahajanapadas, beyond all the politics and economics. What were they eating? What did they wear? What were their homes like?
Yeah, I wish we had more details about that. Unfortunately, a lot of the sources from this period, they focus on the big picture stuff. Political events, economic trends, day-to-day life. That gets a bit less attention.
Believe that.
But we do have some clues. Archaeology helps, and some later texts give us some hints.
Well, clues are better than nothing, right? What do they tell us? What can we piece together about, the lives of these ancient Indians?
Well, from what we can tell, their diet was pretty diverse. They grew all sorts of crops: rice, wheat, barley.
Okay.
They also raised livestock: cattle, sheep, goats.
A pretty balanced diet, then. Makes sense, given how fertile the land was. And that diverse climate. What about clothing? Were they, decked out in fancy robes and jewels? Or was it more practical?
The details are a bit sketchy on that one. But it's likely that style varied, depending on the region and your social status. We know from later texts that cotton was a pretty common fabric. And there's also evidence of silk production, so at least some people had access to some pretty luxurious textiles.
Ooh, cotton and silk, not bad. What about housing? Were people living in, palaces or simple huts or something in between?
The archaeological evidence suggests a mix, really. In the cities, you see more substantial structures, probably built with brick or stone.
Okay.
Those were probably the homes of the wealthy merchants, government officials, religious leaders. But out in the rural areas, the houses were likely much more modest, made of wood or mud brick.
So a real range from simple to sophisticated. It really paints a picture of a diverse and dynamic society, doesn't it? With different levels of wealth and social status. But within all that diversity, were there any unifying elements, culturally or religiously, anything that connected these different Mahajanapada?
That's where things get even more interesting. Remember all those Vedic traditions we talked about before? The hymns, the rituals, the social order?
Yeah.
Well, they were still really influential during the Mahajanapada period, but they were also changing, adapting to all the new realities of the time.
So those traditions, they weren't just static. They were still shaping people's beliefs and practices, even as new ideas and challenges came up. Were there any new religious or philosophical movements popping up alongside those Vedic traditions?
Oh yeah, this era saw the rise of several new movements, including Jainism and Buddhism.
Ah, Jainism and Buddhism.
Yes.
Those are two of the most influential spiritual traditions to come out of India.
Yeah.
What were their core beliefs, and how do they compare to those existing Vedic ideas?
Jainism, they really emphasized nonviolence. Asceticism, the idea that everything is interconnected, that was a pretty radical departure from the Vedic focus on ritual sacrifice and the social hierarchy.
I could see that.
Buddhism, they focused on the path to enlightenment through meditation and understanding suffering. Both traditions, in their own way, offered alternative paths to spiritual fulfillment.
It sounds like it.
They challenged the authority of the Vedic priesthood and appealed to a wide range of people.
So, it was a real marketplace of ideas, right? All these different perspectives on life, death, reality. Did everyone embrace these new ideas, or was there pushback from people who wanted to stick with the Vedic ways?
I'm sure there was a mix of both. New ideas, they always face some resistance, especially when they challenge the established power structures. But the fact that Jainism and Buddhism gained followers from all walks of life, that shows you just how fluid and dynamic this period really was.
Yeah, it's incredible to think about all these philosophical and religious shifts happening at the same time as all those economic and political transformations. It really shows how interconnected everything is, right?
Absolutely. It's all intertwined.
Each aspect of society shaping and influencing the others.
Yeah.
But all of this was happening within a larger context, right?
Right.
The Mahajanapada period wasn't isolated. I mean, those trade routes, they stretched all across India and beyond. These emerging states, they were connected to a whole network of cultures and empires.
Exactly. The Mahajanapada period saw a lot of interaction with other cultures, especially through trade.
Those trade routes, they weren't just carrying goods back and forth.
No, they were carrying ideas too, beliefs, artistic influences.
What kind of exchanges were happening? What kind of impact did they have?
Imagine these caravans, loaded with silk and spices, sure, but also stories, philosophies, even religious practices. Ideas were flowing in both directions. We see Persian influence in some areas, particularly in, like, how they ran their governments.
Huh.
Even hints of contact with the Greek world, especially after Alexander the Great came through.
Wow, it's mind-blowing to think about those ancient connections. Threads of influence stretching across continents, shaping the cultural landscape. It really challenges the idea that these ancient civilizations were somehow, like, isolated. They were dynamic, they were interconnected, engaging with the wider world,
Yeah.
adapting.
Yeah, it highlights how dynamic and interconnected the ancient world actually was. The Mahajanapada period, it was a real crucible of change. It's almost like you're watching the idea of India being forged through all those interactions, conflicts, and exchanges.
It's a fascinating story, but unfortunately our time in this fascinating period has to come to an end, at least for now.
Yeah, it's amazing to think about how all those connections from way back then still kind of ripple through time, you know? They help shape the India we know today. But before we finish up our deep dive into the Mahajanapada period, I want to kind of zoom out for a sec. Big picture time. What stands out to you as the most, like, significant takeaway from this era? You know, for me, it's just the sheer amount of change that happened in, well, a pretty short period of time, relatively speaking. We're talking about, like, fundamental shifts. How people lived, worked, organized themselves. It's almost like, I don't know, like watching a civilization being born. With all its complexities, its contradictions, the Mahajanapada era, it really laid the groundwork for so much of what we think of as, you know, India today. The social structures, political systems, even those philosophical and religious traditions that are still around.
It really makes you think, right, about how decisions made like centuries ago can still be felt today. It's easy to think of this period as just like a stepping stone to the big empires that came later. But the Mahajanapada era, it deserves its own like moment in the spotlight for its dynamism, for how much it contributed to the story of India.
I totally agree. This wasn't just like a warm-up act. It was a time of like experimentation, innovation. It's when that idea of India as like a unified, you know, cultural and political thing,
Right.
it's when that really started to take shape. The Mahajanapadas, with their different political systems, their economies that were like just taking off, their social structures that were always evolving, they were the building blocks, you know?
And they laid the foundation for everything that came after. But as we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a question, something to think about. We've talked about all these huge changes, the shift to settled agriculture, private land ownership, the rise of like powerful states, cities growing, trade expanding. But did all of that, did it really benefit everyone, or did it also create like new inequalities, new tensions, stuff that we're still dealing with today?
That's a question a lot of people are still trying to figure out, you know. Historians, social scientists, everyone. Progress, it often comes with a cost. And while these changes definitely brought some good things, like advances in technology, agriculture, political organization, they probably also made some existing inequalities worse. And created some new ones, too. The concentration of land and wealth in the hands of just a few, the rise of really rigid social hierarchies, the possibility of, like, exploiting labor, all of that, it started during this era.
It's a good reminder that history isn't always just a happy story of progress. It's messy. It's complicated. It's full of, you know, good stuff and bad stuff, triumphs and tragedies, steps forward and steps back.
You got it. And by studying those patterns, by looking at how those choices made so long ago still impact us, well, maybe, just maybe, we can approach the future a little bit differently, with more awareness, with a better understanding of, you know, how connected we all are.
Like that saying, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And if we listen to those rhymes, pay attention to those echoes from the past, well, maybe we can create a better future, a fairer one. Anyway, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Mahajanapada period. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.